The hardest part about waiting for someone to come home is realizing they might return looking exactly the same and still feel like a complete stranger. For 7 years, I imagined the moment Lucas Whitmore would come back to Maple Ridge. Every birthday, every Thanksgiving, every Christmas parade that rolled slowly down Main Street. I caught myself glancing toward the crowd as if he'd somehow appear without warning, wearing that crooked grin that always made trouble seem like a game. We grew up 3 houses apart on Willow Creek Road, where everyone knew everyone else's business before breakfast, and the loudest thing most mornings was old Mr. Dawson's riding mower. Lucas and I built tree forts that collapsed within days, skipped rocks across Graywater Lake until our arms hurt, and swore we'd never let adulthood ruin what we had. Then adulthood showed up wearing camouflage. He enlisted 2 weeks after graduation. I stayed behind and turned my grandfather's dusty garage into a small restoration shop for classic cars, spending my days bringing old machines back to life one bolt at a time. Funny thing about engines, they always tell you what's broken if you're willing to listen. People aren't nearly as generous. The entire town gathered at the bus station on a warm Saturday afternoon in early June because word spread faster than wildfire around here. Homemade flags waved from little hands. Somebody brought chocolate chip cookies. Mrs. Harper cried before the bus even arrived, and her son wasn't the one coming home. I stood near the back with grease still under my fingernails despite scrubbing them twice that morning. I told myself it was because I had work to finish. That was a lie. The truth was I didn't know if my heart could survive watching my best friend step off that bus after all those years. When the doors finally folded open with a tired hiss, conversations stopped all at once. Lucas stepped down carrying a single duffel bag over one shoulder. He looked older, of course, broader across the chest. His sandy brown hair was cut shorter than I'd ever seen it. A faint scar rested near his chin, pale against sun-kissed skin, like a story nobody asked him to tell. But it wasn't any of that made my stomach tighten. It was his eyes. Lucas used to look at the world like every sunrise was an invitation to find trouble before lunch. Now his blue eyes searched every corner before settling anywhere, calm but distant, careful in a way 27-year-olds shouldn't have to be. The mayor shook his hand first. Mrs. Harper hugged him so tightly I thought she might never let go. Kids asked questions he answered with polite smiles. He thanked everyone for coming. Then his gaze drifted across the crowd until it landed on me. Time seemed to hesitate. For one impossible second, I expected him to laugh, drop the bag, and tackle me into the biggest hug of my life. Instead, he offered a small nod. Just a nod. Not cold. Not unfriendly. Just careful. Like we were co-workers passing each other in a grocery store instead of 2 boys who once promised nothing would ever change. I smiled anyway because I didn't know what else to do. "Welcome home," I said when he finally walked close enough for me to hear my own voice over the pounding in my chest. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. "It's good to be back, Owen." The words were familiar. The voice was familiar. But the silence that followed belonged to someone I had never met. The town celebrated long after the welcome home banners came down, but Lucas disappeared before sunset. That alone should have told me something. The old Lucas would have been the last one to leave any gathering, convincing half the neighborhood to stop for burgers or challenging somebody to one more game of pool at Murphy's Tavern. Instead, he slipped away with nothing more than a quiet excuse about being tired. Nobody questioned it. They all said the same thing. He had been through a lot. Give him time. Time sounded simple when you were the one saying it. Living through it was another story. 3 mornings later, I was underneath the hood of a 1967 Mustang when I heard slow footsteps outside the garage. I looked up expecting another customer. Instead, Lucas stood in the open doorway with both hands buried in the pockets of a faded gray sweatshirt. The June sun was already warm, but he looked like someone who still felt cold. "You still fixing impossible projects?" he asked. His voice carried the same calm tone from the bus station, steady but strangely careful, as though every sentence had to pass an inspection before leaving his mouth. I wiped my hands on an old shop towel and smiled. Somebody has to keep these classics alive. He glanced around the garage, taking in the organized rows of tools, the polished chrome bumpers hanging along one wall, and the radio quietly playing an old country station. "Looks good," he said. "You built all this." "Piece by piece." He nodded once, almost impressed, but the conversation stalled there. Silence settled between us like dust floating through sunlight. It felt unfamiliar. Lucas and I used to fill every quiet moment with bad jokes, pointless debates, or plans we would probably never follow through on. Now it seemed neither of us knew which version of the other we were supposed to talk to. I grabbed 2 bottles of root beer from the little refrigerator beside my workbench and handed him one. He thanked me, twisting the cap off without taking a sip. Instead, his eyes wandered toward the open garage door, scanning the parking lot, the empty road beyond it, even the tree line across the street. He was not looking at anything in particular. He was making sure nothing surprised him. The realization landed softly, but stayed heavy. "You sleeping any better?" I asked before I could stop myself. His shoulders stiffened almost too quickly to notice. "Why would you ask that? You look tired." A tiny smile appeared for less than a second. "Guess I cannot fool you. You never could." That almost earned me the old grin. Almost. It flickered across his face before disappearing again, like sunlight slipping behind thick clouds. We spent another hour pretending everything was normal. I tightened bolts while he handed me wrenches without asking which size I needed. Muscle memory survived, even when conversations did not. It reminded me of afternoons in high school, when we rebuilt lawn mowers just to earn enough cash for movie tickets. For a little while, it actually felt easy. Then a delivery truck rolled over a loose metal plate out on Main Street. The loud clang echoed through the garage. Lucas reacted before the sound had even finished bouncing off the walls. His bottle slipped from his hand and shattered across the concrete floor. His breathing changed. His eyes darted toward every exit at once. I had never seen anyone become so completely still and so completely alert at the same time. Neither of us spoke. After several long seconds, he bent down, picking up pieces of broken glass with shaking fingers. "Sorry," he whispered, avoiding my eyes. "I did not mean to make a mess." I crouched beside him and gently took the sharp pieces from his hand before he could keep collecting them. "Lucas," I said quietly, "it is only a bottle." He looked at the scattered glass for a long moment before answering with a voice so soft I almost missed it. "That is what I keep trying to tell myself." The broken glass was gone by noon, but the sound of it seemed to stay inside my head much longer than the shards had stayed on the garage floor. Lucas insisted on helping me finish the Mustang, moving through the shop with quiet precision, yet every unexpected noise made his shoulders tense just enough for me to notice. He always relaxed a second later, almost embarrassed that his body had reacted before his mind could stop it. I pretended not to see because I had the feeling he appreciated being treated like everyone else more than being treated carefully. The following weekend, I suggested we drive out to Greywater Lake, just like we had every summer growing up. We used to spend entire Saturdays there with cheap fishing poles, a cooler full of sandwiches, and absolutely no talent for catching fish. Lucas surprised me by saying yes. We left early in my old blue pickup while the morning fog still floated above the fields like pale ribbons. The drive should have been filled with stories. Instead, country music drifted softly through the speakers while miles of familiar roads passed beneath the tires. Every few minutes, I almost asked him about the years he had been gone. Every few minutes, I decided not to. Some questions felt less like curiosity and more like asking someone to reopen a door they had fought hard to close. When we reached the lake, everything looked exactly as I remembered. The wooden dock leaned a little farther than it used to. The same weathered picnic tables stood beneath towering oak trees. Even the faded sign warning visitors not to feed the geese had somehow survived another 7 years of rain and snow. Nature had been remarkably loyal to memory. People were another matter entirely. We cast our fishing lines into the calm water and settled into the comfortable silence that once came naturally between us. At least I wanted to believe it was comfortable. Lucas stared across the lake more than he watched his fishing line. His eyes followed distant ripples, birds lifting from the shoreline, leaves dancing in the breeze, always searching, always measuring the world around him. I found myself watching him instead of the water. "Remember when you convinced me that turtles could smell peanut butter from a mile away?" I asked with a laugh. A genuine smile finally reached his face. "You actually believed me. I was 12. You spread peanut butter on 3 different rocks. Because you sounded very confident." He laughed. It was quiet, but real. For one beautiful moment, I heard the boy I grew up with. Then the sound faded as quickly as it had arrived. His smile slipped away, leaving only a thoughtful expression behind. "You deserved a smarter best friend," he said. "I never wanted a smarter one." He looked down at the dock beneath his boots. You deserved one who stayed. The sentence landed harder than I expected. I wanted to remind him that joining the military had been his dream long before graduation. I wanted to tell him nobody blamed him for leaving. Instead, I simply said, "You came back." Lucas took a slow breath that seemed too heavy for such a peaceful afternoon. Physically, his fishing line drifted lazily across the water while neither of us moved to reel it in. Somewhere across the lake, a father cheered as his little daughter caught her first fish, and the sound of her laughter carried easily over the water. Lucas watched them for several seconds before speaking again. "Do you ever feel like everybody else kept living while you got stuck somewhere that no longer exists?" I looked at him carefully. There was no bitterness in his voice, only exhaustion, the kind that sleep could never fix. I answered honestly because anything less felt unfair. "Sometimes I felt that after you left. Like the town kept moving, but one part of my life stayed frozen waiting for you to come home." He turned toward me then, really looked at me for the first time since stepping off that bus. There was surprise in his eyes, followed by something quieter, something almost painfully grateful. Neither of us noticed that our fishing lines had drifted together beneath the surface until I tried to reel mine in and felt the gentle pull of his line tangled with my own. The tangled fishing lines took both of us several minutes to undo, and somehow that tiny problem felt easier to solve than everything neither of us knew how to say. Lucas even smiled once when I managed to hook my own sleeve instead of the knot between the lines. "You have not improved much," he said with the faintest trace of the teasing voice I remembered from high school. "That is a cruel thing to say to the man saving your fishing trip," I answered, and for a heartbeat it almost felt normal again. Almost. On the drive back to Maple Ridge, the sun dipped low across the fields, turning old red barns and endless rows of corn into shades of gold. Lucas rested one arm against the truck door, watching the landscape slide by without speaking. I let the silence exist. Not every quiet moment needed rescuing. Some simply needed company. A few days later, I decided to clean the storage loft above my garage. Years of forgotten boxes, rusty signs, cracked picture frames, and old tools had collected enough dust to qualify as historical artifacts. I climbed the narrow wooden ladder with a flashlight and started sorting through things my grandfather had refused to throw away. Somewhere beneath a stack of faded camping gear and an old baseball glove with missing laces, I found a weathered cedar box I had not seen since I was a teenager. My name was written across the lid in my grandfather's careful handwriting. Curious, I brushed away the dust and opened it. Inside were photographs, ticket stubs from county fairs, a friendship bracelet Lucas had insisted we wear for an entire summer when we were 11, and beneath them rested a thick bundle of envelopes tied together with faded blue string. Every envelope carried the same familiar handwriting. Mine. My hand suddenly felt very still. There was no return address, only my name written across the front again and again in dark blue ink. The postmarks stretched across 7 years. None of the envelopes had ever been opened. They had never even been mailed. I sat down on the old wooden floorboards as afternoon sunlight slipped through the attic window, catching tiny specks of dust that floated around me like quiet memories refusing to settle. For several minutes, I simply stared at the bundle, trying to understand how letters Lucas had written could have ended up hidden inside my grandfather's old storage box. Maybe he had dropped them here before leaving. Maybe he had planned to send them and never found the courage. Maybe there was another explanation entirely. My thumb rested against the edge of the top envelope. It would have been easy to open it. Nobody else was there. Nobody would ever know. But the letters belonged to the version of Lucas who had lived through years I could never fully understand. Reading them without permission felt like walking into a room after hearing someone whisper not to come inside. I slipped the bundle back into the box, then stopped. Curiosity won one small battle against restraint. I turned over the last envelope because it had never been sealed. A single folded sheet had slipped halfway out. I did not unfold it completely. I only caught one handwritten sentence before instinct made me slide it back where it belonged. It read, "Some days I forget what home sounds like, so I keep replaying your laugh in my head." The word struck something deep inside me. I closed the box immediately, my chest suddenly too tight for the warm attic air. Lucas had never forgotten me. Whatever had happened during those 7 years, whatever invisible weight he carried behind those careful blue eyes, one thing had remained untouched. Somewhere, Across all that distance, across every season we had spent apart, he had still been writing to me, even if the letters never found their way home. For the next few days, I carried the cedar box around in my thoughts far more often than I carried wrenches around my garage. The unopened letters remained exactly where I had found them, tucked safely back into the loft because they were never really mine until Lucas chose to share them. Still, I could not forget that single sentence about remembering my laugh. It echoed through ordinary moments, making every conversation between us feel like there were pages missing from a story we had both lived. Summer settled over Maple Ridge with bright afternoons and warm evenings filled with the scent of fresh-cut grass. Business at the shop stayed steady, and Lucas stopped by almost every day. Sometimes he helped organize parts. Sometimes he simply sat on an old stool drinking coffee while I worked. He never stayed long, but each visit lasted a little longer than the one before. We did not force conversations anymore. We talked about baseball scores, old neighbors, the diner reopening after renovations, and whether the town should finally replace the faded welcome sign near the highway. Those ordinary topics slowly built a bridge where silence had once stood. One Friday evening, dark clouds gathered faster than anyone expected. The local weather report mentioned scattered thunderstorms, nothing unusual for late June. I was locking up the garage when the first heavy raindrops splashed against the pavement. Before I could climb into my truck, Lucas pulled into the parking lot in his old pickup. He rolled down the window with a small smile. "Need a ride to the diner? I figured you were probably skipping dinner again." I laughed. "You still remember my bad habits. Some things are easier to remember than others." We ate grilled chicken sandwiches and shared a basket of fries while rain drummed steadily against the restaurant windows. For nearly an hour, everything felt lighter than it had since his return. Lucas even told a funny story about accidentally saluting the wrong officer during training because he had been distracted by a squirrel stealing somebody's lunch. The entire booth filled with laughter, and I realized I had missed hearing his laugh almost as much as I had missed hearing his voice. By the time we stepped outside, the storm had grown stronger. Lightning flashed somewhere beyond the hills, followed several seconds later by a deep roll of thunder. I unlocked my truck, but another brilliant flash lit the parking lot before I could open the door. The thunder that followed seemed to shake the ground beneath us. Lucas froze instantly. The smile disappeared from his face as though it had never existed. His breathing became uneven, and his eyes searched the empty parking lot with growing confusion. "Lucas," I said gently, taking one careful step closer, "look at me." He did not answer. Rain soaked through both our shirts within seconds, but he seemed completely unaware of it. Another distant rumble rolled across the sky. Before I could say another word, he reached forward and held onto me with both hands as if he had suddenly lost his balance. It was not dramatic or desperate. It was simply human. His grip trembled slightly while he lowered his head, trying to steady his breathing. I did not ask questions. I did not tell him everything would be fine because I suspected empty promises were the last thing he needed. I simply stayed there beneath the rain, letting him know he was not standing alone. After several quiet moments, his breathing slowly returned to normal. He stepped back immediately, embarrassment filling his face. "I am sorry," he said, unable to meet my eyes. "You have nothing to apologize for." He gave a small shake of his head. "You should not have to see me like this." I looked at him for a long moment before answering with complete honesty. "Lucas, if this is who you are right now, then this is exactly the person I want to stand beside." He blinked as though nobody had ever said those words to him before, and for the first time since he came home, the wall between us seemed to crack just enough for a little light to find its way through. The rain finally eased into a gentle drizzle by the time we reached my truck, but neither of us seemed eager to start the engine. Water dripped steadily from the brim of my baseball cap, while Lucas stared through the windshield at the quiet parking lot. The storm had passed outside. I had the feeling another one was still passing through him. We sat there without speaking for several minutes until he let out a slow breath that sounded as though he had been holding it for years instead of seconds. "I keep telling myself that I am home," he said quietly, "but sometimes my mind does not believe it." I turned slightly toward him without interrupting. He deserved the chance to finish his own thoughts without feeling rushed. "Everybody keeps saying I made it back," he continued. "They smile. They shake my hand. They tell me how proud they are. I appreciate every word. I really do. But nobody sees the part of me that never seems to unpack. He gave a tired laugh that carried no humor. I came home with one duffel bag, Owen. Somehow it still feels like I am carrying 1,000 pounds. I understood there were experiences I could never fully imagine, and I was not about to pretend otherwise. You do not have to carry all of it by yourself, I said. He looked down at his hands resting in his lap. That is exactly what scares me. His answer caught me off guard. Why? Because the closer I let someone get, the more they will notice I am different. He paused before continuing. You remember who I was before I left. I remember him too. He laughed at everything. He believed every problem had a solution if you worked hard enough. He thought coming home would mean picking up where life stopped. His eyes lifted to meet mine. That person is gone. I shook my head gently. I do not think he is. You only think that because you want him to be. No. My voice stayed calm. I think he is still here because I catch glimpses of him every day. I saw him when you laughed about that squirrel stealing somebody's lunch. I saw him at Greywater Lake when you made fun of my fishing skills. I even saw him this afternoon when you reminded me that I still skip dinner whenever I get busy. He listened without speaking. Maybe he is not gone, I continued. Maybe he is just tired. Lucas looked away. Again, blinking several times before speaking. I have been avoiding you. I noticed. Not because I stopped caring. His voice became almost a whisper. Because I care too much. Every time I looked at you after coming home, I kept wondering when you would realize I was not the same friend you waited for. I smiled sadly. Lucas, I realized that the first minute you stepped off that bus. His shoulders fell slightly. Then why are you still here? I answered without needing time to think. Because I was never waiting for some perfect version of you to come back. I was waiting for you. Silence filled the truck once more, but it no longer felt empty. It felt honest. Lucas slowly rubbed one hand across his face before giving the smallest nod. There is something I need to show you, he said. Not tonight. I am not ready tonight. But soon. I did not ask what it was. Whatever burden he had been carrying for 7 years, I knew trust could not be rushed. As we drove through the quiet streets of Maple Ridge beneath clearing skies, I realized something had changed between us. The distance was still there, but it was no longer a wall. It had become a road, and for the first time since Lucas returned home, we were finally walking toward each other instead of away. 3 evenings later, Lucas knocked on the side door of my garage just as I was finishing the paperwork for the day. He looked calmer than he had in weeks, although the thoughtful expression never seemed to leave his face anymore. He held a small canvas backpack over one shoulder and asked, Do you still remember the overlook above Miller Point? I smiled before he had even finished the question. The place where we promised we would watch the sunset after we finally became adults. He nodded. I think we forgot to keep that promise. 20 minutes later, we were climbing the narrow trail that wound through tall pine trees overlooking Greywater Lake. The path had not changed much since we were teenagers. The wooden railing was a little older, the steps a little more uneven, but the view waiting at the top remained exactly as breathtaking as I remembered. The lake reflected the evening sky like polished glass, while streaks of orange, pink, and deep blue stretched across the horizon. We sat on the weathered bench that had somehow survived countless winters, saying very little as the sun slowly drifted lower. Lucas finally reached into his backpack and pulled out the bundle of envelopes tied together with faded blue string. My heart skipped the moment I recognized them. I wondered when you found these, he said with a quiet smile. You knew? My grandfather told me before he passed away. He said if I ever came back and still wanted you to read them, he had kept them somewhere safe. I looked down at the letters resting between us. I only saw one sentence. I could not bring myself to open the rest. He gave a slow nod. Thank you. The gratitude in those 2 words felt deeper than anything else he had said since returning home. Why did you never send them? I asked gently. Lucas stared out across the water before answering. At first I thought I would write once everything settled down. Then I thought I would wait until I had better news. After that I kept convincing myself that every letter sounded too heavy. I did not want my worst days becoming your burden. He smiled sadly. So I kept writing them anyway. I just never mailed them. I rested one hand on the stack without opening it. You should know something too. He turned toward me. My pulse suddenly felt louder than the evening breeze moving through the trees. I had imagined saying these words 100 different ways over the years, but none of those rehearsed speeches seemed honest anymore. Only the truth mattered now. People always asked why I never left Maple Ridge. I began. Some thought I was afraid of change. Others assumed I loved the garage too much. I let out a quiet breath. The real answer was much simpler. Lucas watched me without interrupting. Every time I imagined building a life somewhere else, it never felt complete because you were missing from it. I dated a few people. They were kind. They deserved someone who could give them his whole heart. I smiled faintly. Mine was never available. Lucas lowered his eyes, and for a moment I wondered if I had said too much. Then he whispered, "Owen." My name sounded different in his voice, softer than I had ever heard it before. I spent 7 years telling myself that coming home meant I had to learn how to be your friend again. He swallowed carefully before continuing. I never stopped to ask whether friendship was all I had been protecting. The evening breeze carried the scent of pine and fresh water around us, while the last light of day settled over the lake. Neither of us rushed to fill the silence, because for the first time it no longer hid uncertainty. It carried understanding. Lucas slowly reached over and rested his hand beside mine on the bundle of unopened letters. Our fingers brushed for only a second, simple and gentle, yet somehow that small moment said everything neither of us had been brave enough to admit for years. The sky turned deeper shades of blue as the last edge of sunlight disappeared behind the hills, yet neither of us seemed ready to leave the overlook. The unopened letters still rested between our hands, no longer feeling like reminders of lost years, but proof that neither of us had ever truly walked away from the other. Lucas slowly drew his hand back and looked toward the quiet lake below. "There were nights when I honestly believed I would never see this place again," he said. His voice remained calm, but every word carried the weight of someone remembering a long journey home. Whenever things became overwhelming, I closed my eyes and pictured Maple Ridge. I pictured this lake. I pictured the old garage with the faded blue door. Most of all, I pictured you laughing at one of my terrible jokes. He smiled to himself. "It sounds ridiculous now." I shook my head. "It does not sound ridiculous at all." He looked at me with a softness I had never seen before. "You became the safest memory I had." A gentle breeze moved through the pine trees, carrying the scent of warm earth and summer leaves. Everything around us felt remarkably peaceful, as though the entire town had paused long enough to let two old friends finally catch up with the years they had lost. "Do you know what finally convinced me that I had to come back?" Lucas asked. I waited quietly. One evening I realized I could remember the sound of your laugh more clearly than I could remember my own voice. He let out a slow breath. That frightened me, not because I was forgetting myself, but because I realized the person I missed most had never stopped being you. My chest tightened in the gentlest way. There were moments in life when no carefully planned speech could compete with simple honesty. I spent years thinking I was protecting our friendship by keeping my feelings to myself. I admitted. I told myself that if I said nothing, then I could never lose you. I smiled faintly. The funny thing is that silence almost made me lose you anyway. Lucas nodded slowly. I was afraid too. Of what? Of coming home and discovering you had built a beautiful life that no longer had room for me. I laughed softly. Lucas, I left an empty chair beside me for 7 years. He looked down, and I noticed his eyes glistening in the fading light. I never asked you to wait. You never had to. Neither of us spoke again for several moments. The quiet between us no longer felt uncertain. It felt earned. Lucas finally reached for my hand, giving me every opportunity to pull away if I wanted. I did not. Our fingers met naturally, as though they had remembered something our minds had forgotten. He smiled, and this time it was the smile I had carried in my memory through every holiday, every lonely birthday, and every ordinary afternoon he had missed. "I think I finally understand something," he whispered. "Coming home was never only about returning to this town. What was it about?" He looked directly into my eyes before answering. "Finding the person who always made this place feel like home." Emotion caught in my throat, leaving me unable to answer with words. Instead, I stepped a little closer. Lucas searched my face one last time, making sure there was no hesitation, and I answered with a small nod. The first kiss we shared was brief, gentle, and filled with quiet certainty rather than surprise. When we stepped back, neither of us rushed to explain what had happened because nothing needed explaining anymore. The years apart had not erased what we felt. They had simply taken us the long way around to discover that the home we had both spent so much time searching for had never been a place at all. It had always been waiting in the person standing beside us. The summer slowly gave way to early autumn, And for the first time in years, I stopped measuring time by how long Lucas had been gone. Instead, I measured it by the quiet moments we were finally able to share. Some mornings he arrived at the garage before I unlocked the front door, already carrying 2 cups of coffee from the diner because he knew I always forgot breakfast when work became busy. Other afternoons, we worked side by side restoring old trucks and classic cars, talking about everything from football scores to childhood memories that somehow felt brighter now than they had before. Healing did not happen all at once. There were still evenings when sudden thunderstorms made Lucas grow unusually quiet. There were still restless nights when sleep did not come easily. The difference was that he no longer tried to carry every difficult moment alone. Little by little, he learned that trusting someone did not make him weak. It simply reminded him that home was not something a person had to build by himself. One Saturday morning, I handed him a fresh set of keys while we stood inside the garage. He looked at them with a puzzled expression. "What are these for?" he asked. I smiled. "The expansion project." Several months earlier, I had purchased the empty building next door with the dream of turning it into a second restoration bay. I had delayed the renovation because it never felt right doing it alone. "You are serious?" Lucas asked. "Completely." I placed the keys in his hand. "This place has always been my dream. I think it would mean a lot more if it became ours." He looked around the garage, then back at me, his eyes reflecting the same mixture of surprise and gratitude I had seen the evening we confessed our feelings at the overlook. "I have not worked on cars since high school," he admitted with a laugh. "Then you are overdue for a refresher." Before long, the familiar sound of tools echoed through both buildings as we transformed the empty space together. Neighbors stopped by to welcome Lucas home all over again, this time not as the young man who had returned after years away, but as someone beginning a brand new chapter. Mrs. Harper brought homemade pie every Friday. Mr. Dawson insisted on giving free advice that nobody asked for. Even the teenagers who wandered in hoping to learn about classic cars stayed, because Lucas patiently taught them whatever he knew. Watching him smile without forcing it became one of my favorite parts of every day. One cool October evening, we closed the shop early and drove to Greywater Lake just before sunset. The water reflected shades of gold exactly as it had when we were children, yet everything felt different because neither of us was waiting for life to begin anymore. We were already living it. Lucas slipped his hand into mine as we stood quietly at the end of the old dock. "Do you remember what you told me the night it rained outside the diner?" he asked. I nodded. "I said I wanted to stand beside the person you were, not the person you used to be." He smiled, his blue eyes finally carrying the warmth I had missed for so many years. "You kept that promise." I looked across the calm lake before answering. "So did you. You came home." He shook his head gently. "I thought coming home meant returning after leaving the army." His fingers tightened softly around mine. "Now I know the truth. Home was never just this town. Home was always the person who never stopped believing I would find my way back." As the last light settled across the water, I realized some journeys do not end when someone walks through the front door. They end when 2 hearts finally stop searching because they have found exactly where they belong.